Hey, welcome to So True. And the devotional today is entitled Our Only Hope. And it's based on Psalm 62, verses 5 through 8. In fact, as we get going, let me read that text. Psalm 62, verse 5. My soul waits silently for God alone, for my expectation is from Him. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. In God is my salvation and my glory. The rock of my strength and my refuge is in God. Trust in Him at all times, you people. Pour out your heart before Him. God is a refuge for us. In his autobiography, In Pursuit of His Glory, R.T. Kendall, who followed Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones at Westminster Chapel, tells of how the great American Baptist theologian Carl Henry became a favorite summer preacher at the chapel. One of the memories that stood out to R.T. Kendall during that time was while driving Carl Henry to a service at the chapel, he asked him, Carl, if you had your life to live over, what would you do differently? The great theologian paused for a moment, and as the car passed Buckingham Palace in London, he said this, I would remember that only God can turn water into wine. What an intriguing answer. Philosophically, he was challenging naturalism and the denial of the miraculous. Theologically, Carl Henry is defending the majesty and omnipotence of God. But more than anything, personally, he is reminding himself and us to trust God more, to make God our only hope. Carl Henry wants us all to cultivate a bigger faith in a bigger God. This wise word teaches a little bit of God makes up for a great deal less of us. This startling statement, in large measure, rebukes our trust of self, our high view of man, and our human scheming and lack of waiting on God. If only God can turn water into wine, then we must center our trust, hope, and confidence in God alone. With this call for a greater trust in God ringing in our ears, we turn to Psalm 62, where David expresses a solitary trust in God. If you read Psalm 62, verse 1, 2, 5, and 6, David confesses that God alone, God only, is his trust. God alone is his rock and redeemer. Faced with either Saul's jealousy or Absalom's rebellion as the historical background, we find David speaking about putting all his eggs in the basket of God as his only hope. David believes God to be true. He says that in verses 8 through 10. David expects God to defend and deliver him, verse 5. David is unworried given the power of God, verse 11. Amid pending peril, David celebrates with an unshakable confidence that God can be trusted alone and always, verse 2, 6, and 8. A closer look at the text shows us three things that help David's belief that only God can turn water into wine, that God is the believer's only hope. First, David got involved in a little theological self-talk in verses 5 and 6. He exhorts himself to expect great things from a great God. There is no extended brooding over his enemies or circumstances, but rather a filling of his mind with thoughts about God. You can cross-reference that to the self-talk of David in Psalm 42, verse 5, and Psalm 43, verse 5. Second, David reminds himself to wait on the Lord. You find that in verse 5 and in verse 1, right on the doorstep of the psalm. He cautions himself not to run ahead, not to get ahead of his problem in a way that runs ahead of God. David reminds himself that a humanly manufactured response, apart from God's help, can add to the problem, not solve it. David's waiting is not passive, however. It's an active looking to God for an answer. And thirdly, David pours out his heart in prayer to God, verse 8. Within the grammar of the text, trusting God and praying are synonymous. To say that you trust God is to say your prayers. And in praying, we enlist the help of God. As noted, a little bit more of God helps for a great deal less of us. Seeing God as our only hope requires persuasion, patience, and prayer. Ron Dunn, the beloved Baptist evangelist, said, quote, Christians are people of the only. I hope that's true of you. I want it to be true of me. Let's live in a way that shows God only is our rock, salvation, and defense. Let's be people of the only hope.